Before the premiere, I dreamed that there was someone in the audience and he raised his gun and tried to shoot us. It was my dream. But it means I was really fearful that maybe we will be on the list of China, that we will be in danger physically.
The show This Is Not an Embassy, about Taiwan's struggles to maintain diplomatic relations around the world, embarked on its world tour in 2023. As a show which deals in the intricacies of international law, its runaway success has surprised no one so much as its star, Chia Kuo. She thinks that part of the reason the show has sold out across Europe is increasing attention on an issue which for decades even the Taiwanese themselves have mostly ignored.
It's a bit sad to say, I think Taiwanese people, since we were kids, we know that Taiwan cannot be called Taiwan in some places, or we have to call ourselves Chinese Taipei. We have many questions in mind, but I think it's like we are very used to it.
One of the few places still allowed to call Taiwan by its official name is St. Vincent and the Grenadines, an island nation of 100,000 people in the Eastern Caribbean. Andrea Bowman is its ambassador. Here, flanked by high-ranking members of the Taiwanese Foreign Ministry, she is presiding over her country's National Day celebrations in Taipei.
I can say very confidently that there is not a single Vincentian that is unaware of the relationship between St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Taiwan. We respect each other as sovereign countries, and we have really stood with each other in a systematic and a consistent and a faithful manner for these 43 years.
But St. Vincent is member to a rapidly shrinking group of faithfuls. Just days into the new year, and immediately following Taiwan's presidential election, the tiny Pacific island nation of Nauru made an announcement which created a wave of global attention unheard of for a country of barely 12,000 people. They were switching diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China in the latest coup for Beijing. And with every Nauru comes a raft of alarming headlines and panicked opinion columns from across the democratic world. Will Taiwan continue to lose diplomatic allies? How important even are these often small, resource-poor, and distant countries? And if official allies are abandoning Taiwan, what are the secret lifelines it must grab onto in an increasingly dangerous world? Welcome to Finding Formosa. Stay with your isle.
Unlike some other countries where I think almost 99.9% of the countries recognize their sovereignty, Taiwan, due to its long-term historical conflict with China, is only recognized by a very few countries in the world.
现在台湾的邦交国大概只剩下是一个而已，而且这些邦交国大体上来讲都是我们可以算是国家比较小的。
China is exercising its so-called One China doctrine, which try to force every country who want to recognize China to cease their relationship with Taiwan.
Immediately after World War II, the Republic of China, ROC government, was globally recognized as the legitimate representative of the Chinese nation. This began to change in 1949, when the ROC lost to Mao Zedong's communists in the Chinese Civil War and retreated to Taiwan. A legitimacy battle ensued as both the rulers of the ROC, Taiwan, and PRC, China, claimed to be the legitimate representatives of a true China. The real turning point came in 1971, when the United Nations voted to recognize the PRC as the legitimate representative of China. Since the rulers of Taiwan also believed themselves to be China, they refused multiple proposed compromises for dual representation. Even after this, Taiwan retained 20 to 30 official allies, but as China grew in both power and wealth, it started to seek diplomatic revenge against its one-time rival.
St. Vincent and the Grenadines has been approached and will constantly be approached, by Trying to think. But the point is, we understand the types of pressures that are particularly brought to bear on Taiwan's allies.
There has been a lot of pressure, around the Pacific especially, and it has been the focus of news media all around the world. And that pressure is to value a lot, whether we're switching or not.
I'm really interested in this sort of why would a country maintain relations with Taiwan? This was a long time ago. I remember being at a conference. They were talking about how these relations are really deep with Taiwan, that they're secure, that they're going to stay with Taiwan for the long haul. And I remember looking it up, and this country had switched sides 3 times or 4 times, and wasn't a democracy, so it wasn't on democratic affinities. So I really started to think why would you stay? And the more that I looked into it, the more it seems to be economics, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, money is a big part of it, and it's essentially 2 components. One is what personally enriches the elites. They have a larger checkbook, and also in terms of the pipeline of investment that they can offer.
It was one of the main strategies of Taiwan for a long time. They had the money compared to China, and this is how you're able to compete. Taiwan might say it's because we're similar in these ways. Well, a lot of your partners at one point were non-democracies.
Taiwan likes to position itself as a proponent of democracy, but often what it does in these countries is corrode democracy. To give the example of the Solomon Islands, they cooked up this thing called the Rural Constituency Development Fund, by which every MP was given more or less a blank check of funds to spend on their re-election. So yeah, it's not a black and white case of Taiwan going there and defending democracy.
The money that Taiwan often invests in these states that recognize them for agricultural development or economic development, you've created the foundation for them to now be able to do things that they couldn't before. They become sort of dependent on exports, and they pivot towards China.
Solomon's had almost no trade with Taiwan at all. So switching to China gives Solomon Islands not just wealth for the political elite, but also the prospect of new investments in a whole range of sectors that Taiwan simply can't offer.
And I remember talking to an official years ago about aren't you just paying for them to leave eventually? And they said that we don't really have another choice there.
And as the economic power gap between China and Taiwan only yawns ever wider, the Chinese economy was 24 times larger than Taiwan's in 2023. Taiwan will never be able to buy its way back to the negotiating table. Many question how serious of an issue this really is.
People sometimes would debate about whether we can just drop all the diplomatic allies, which is not realistic, because although the economy scales of our diplomatic allies are not as big as Taiwan, but actually, in the international organization, for example, the UN, every country has a seat.
We speak for Taiwan in every international fora which we, find ourselves in. We speak for Taiwan. We stand with Taiwan. We speak for Taiwan, and we recognize Taiwan's sovereignty.
We help Taiwan have a voice. During the United Nations, in the statements of our government, there is always a mention of Taiwan and how it deserves full membership in the United Nations and to be recognized as a sovereign nation.
You could say all those sayings never really reach to any concrete ends, but the point is, if the voices disappear, that could actually cause a higher level problem because no one is willing to actually talk for Taiwan.
If one day Taiwan has 0 diplomatic allies, it means we will be put into the framework of One China policy.
跟中国建交的条件是什么？你就是要去承认一个中国。那你在一个中国的一个框架之下，等于是绕入中国的一个圈套。因为假如在国际社会上面来讲，接受台湾是一个中国的内政的一个问题的时候，涉入台海议题的正当性就会出现问题。
Which means if China launch a war to Taiwan, the other countries cannot step into it.
这些邦交国家对台湾来讲很重要的是让台湾作为一个主权独立的国家在国际社会上面的一个指标性来讲。不过我说这只是这种 image 这种形象来讲。
So part of it is symbolic, frankly. Now, I think these formal institutions, say the UN, WHO, are very important, but you're talking about 12 states if you include the Vatican, and none of those have the ability to defend Taiwan if it came to that.
Having 12 allies is better than having 10 allies, 5 allies, or would 12 be different than 22? In reality, it won't change that much.
Often it gets a lot of media attention that this country has broken relations. We set up the stage that it is this bigger security issue than it really is. And in fact, I'd even go a further step that I think that it is intentional that China has not attempted to take all of Taiwan's diplomatic partners at one time. You can draw this out over time so that it gets more attention. But what you've actually seen really in the last 10 years or so is this proliferation of these unofficial relations that really gets Taiwan into a much better position than, frankly, it was in the 80s or the 90s, where they had more formal recognition, but most of these informal partnerships were pretty thin.
美国、日本还有像欧洲的这些国家跟台湾都没有正式的外交关系，可是相较于这些所谓的邦交国家，对台湾在安全上面的这个协助，还有在经贸上面的这个重要性，其实是更大。
And you can see this. They send their best people. They send most of their resources to Washington D.C., to Canberra, to the European capitals, to Brussels. That's where the main game is. It's not in formal recognition. It's in unofficial, tacit support for Taiwan. And that is really the main game.
And in fact, I would say that Taiwan has been exceptionally good at blurring the line of official and unofficial recognition. Pick a major country, US, Canada, most of EU, Australia, etc., have, what looks like an embassy, but don't call it an embassy. You're right up to the line without actually breaking traditional protocol here.
Compared to where they were 10, 15 years ago, I think they're doing pretty well. You had an attitude, even in Australia 15 years ago, that Taiwan was just a bit of a nuisance, and particularly in the Pacific, that it was a nuisance and we'd be better rid of them altogether. Now, before Solomon Islands switched to China, you had this improbable coalition of Australia and New Zealand and Japan and the US all banding together to try to stop them switching.
They actually conducted surveys to talk about what's the percentage of Americans was willing to support sending American troops to protect Taiwan. The number used to be pretty low, like just 20% or 18%. Nowadays it's jumped to about 40%. This is not just for Americans, this is also for Europeans, also for Japanese, for Australians.
It's a very new thing, and I think in some ways has to be held as a success of Taiwan's diplomacy.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs can get credit, and I think there has been very effective use of unofficial paths as well.
I remember a German grandpa, he drove 3 hours from the forest to the theater to watch the show. And I asked the grandpa why he's so interested in our show. He said, because Taiwan's history reminds him about Western Germany and Eastern Germany history. So I kind of realized that, okay, so the European audience, they can connect our shows with their own history.
And I honestly think once people think about the issue, once people think about what Taiwan stands for, what Taiwan represents, Taiwan may lose allies, but Taiwan is going to gain more friends and more recognition of why Taiwan has to be protected.